Last week I heard some commentators talking about the issue even at the local level.
Almost be like the opposite of what you want. It's normally just from a security and robustness perspective, you actually make the argument that if you're going to specify, specify the opposite. You need to access redundancy.
Exactly. They still have that like old school mentality, right?
Not to much.
Yeah.
Kind of a
I didn't know the whole history of that.
Right. It's like
Came up last week and I was hearing some of the people talked about even at the local level about how
It's good company. I know a lot of people that
you have this issue of
in the finance area and stuff like that. It's a huge
there's a word for public access, and the question is, okay, if you have U.S. government agency or local agency, what is sort of equal access? Is it the user, the citizen gets free access to all the data, or is it they have free access to some of the data, but if they use a lot of the data, then they got to pay? And is that in the spirit of giving the citizen access to data? Because obviously the U.S. government does, if you got the private AWS or whatever, they are obviously charging. And if a citizen is using more capacity, then at what point do you start charging?
Don't they? Doesn't Salesforce have a nonprofit version of
It does. But they also know that
very much
some of the agencies have moved data over, like weather data,
there's also
background of Google or things like that. They also know as they move it over into usage, it goes up by 10 to 100 times because it's so easy to get to, as opposed to being locked up and trying to get something from the government.
There's also a lot of issues that equality is not necessarily equal to equity in these cases. For some of this data to be useful, you need a lot of it. In order for some of it to be useful, you need relatively small amount of it. So you need a lot of stock prices to make a difference between a lot of weather data if you want to build a fund. And yet, stock prices are probably get a nice return on that. It's not so much.
Being on cloud now, it's like any organization.
And costs have gone down too.
Interesting.
Part of that.
It's
It's a good thing, I think. It's a great thing. So it's a good thing I found that.
See you again.
Yeah, a lot of opportunity in that space.
I think
Ask you folks.
doing your own thing was takes a lot.
It's tough when you're just on your own because you gotta like do the work, but also.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing a little out of breath. Go to
There
shower.
was like
What was your name
50
again?
Cat.
Pat, nice to meet you. My first time in this building, so.
Well, were you thinking something?
No, not at all.
But coded things like
More about how to try to line up.
Is that right? What's your, right?
Yeah, so 1871 is
You never know, right? You never know.
by the city of Chicago, private investors, and
You ever want like
incubator for startups.
Now, is this also in other cities? Because I feel like,
Not 1871, but there are similar
1871.
concepts of it.
got it, yes, because I lived in DC.
I'm not sure what you mean
Right
by
outside
these
DC for a couple of years, and I remember something
Well, there's
like
something called 1776, which is modeled after.
And
that. That
multiple
may have been it,
different,
yes, I
partners
do
and
remember
sponsors
being
as well.
over. All right,
And
and
talk
are
about the
you
differences
from
in
Chicago?
Right.
Or just familiar with?
So you're just looking a little deeper down the
Oh, you
funnel
did?
than I need to get tonight, so that's because I have so much time.
So, yeah. What's that?
I said I feel sorry for you.
You lived in DC for how long?
Just 2 years. I was there for school. But I actually just lived in DC. I was right outside
Where'd you go?
Alexandria, George Washington. Yeah, and how,
We're
what about
very
you
old
there?
organizations like that.
Oh, you did? How long ago was that?
We're gonna go listen to that.
It was a different place. Did you stay with school or did you work as well?
No, I wouldn't
Okay.
DC's been evolving for many years. It's a much nicer city.
And it used to be, yeah, and did you actually live in the city while you were close to Georgetown?
Yeah, I lived in
That was going to be my first option, but they didn't give me funding, so that quickly changed my decision. But I was, yes, so that wouldn't be it. But I was actually afterwards I was grateful because there isn't really a communication. Switch down outside of that area. So yes, it was Saturday. It was really nice to get to watch the yeah, so it's really fun. That's an issue. I planned for it, but didn't plan well. So I was really happy to be back in Chicago. No, but I lived there for about 4 years before I came out. So I'm familiar with it. Very helpful.
I know she's usually like change jobs and data trust and skill development.
Then when you graduate,
her project, which is going to be announced actually 2 months ago.
So this is supposed to help.
Cool, you do well, and then also like Wednesday.
I've never seen
I
more
didn't call them before,
you can't get attention on strategic matters because the tactical stuff is just up to our eyebrows right now.
Yeah, so yeah.
Try again.
So I worked in
Try to get it done.
Thank you for being interested. As I said, if you reach out and send it, I'm sure you'll right through. Just give me a few things.
Your technology is so in its way, like,
what is
but
your
they're helping out after. Right. So one guy,
How are we doing on this?
one guy works, lives under like a nonprofit, but he's a consultant too. She's got technology. The other guy who helps aggregate other together. So we might get
This is it here all the time.
I'm trying to. Have you heard of that's a great idea. There's tons of skills that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I'm sure that must have been
Well, now, now it's so easy. I mean, you can run a desk here and other communities together. Your office space is over. So, 10 years ago,
I guess we were right, exactly. Did you find any of that stuff?
Yeah. I'm back. Here, how's it going? Great, how are you? Very good. I'm a main caser with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really do a lot of stuff.
It's funny because in all places that I've been in,
Topics, I was reading about,
every time
I know Jeremy, but David, what do you do?
I went to small consulting. Okay, let's see here.
So I'm in our strategy operations.
So where are you looking now?
Right now I have like more than 5 clients. I'm really interested in
So you're not doing grants for
primarily. Yeah, absolutely. Product side.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they are, but consumers need to be smart enough to know that.
So they demand certain things.
I like it.
They'll have to
Yeah,
do
like
it.
the car.
It's funny how it's like.
Well, yeah, I'm very into that. Because this, you can bet college
Yeah. They're
what is
They're all there. Cool.
Although each one of the studies is based on quite a lot about the the question is, how much do these programs generalize?
Sorry?
Yeah.
So this is, various kinds of Ratner provide non-solid, which is kind of my little
This
it's, I mean, that's a growing interest. Yeah. With base and essence,
So how do you
I could deny it, but it's
pretty good.
I have to take
I read your white paper.
I think we should
Hi, thank you for doing this.
sit down afterwards.
My son's supposed to be an exit.
I don't believe it's
I was just talking
He's got no example. You work 50 years and you can either so basically you're providing
What side?
because you have people who not able to because they've actually worked the whole system.
The basic idea is
Go with the understanding will work with the system and you will
I like that. I read your white paper.
and they have a unique value because they understand.
Yeah, I sent it to him on my good friends. It was life changing.
But it's one of these, some of the stuff is the same there's also some stuff that we've developed based on those ideas that's new. So I feel like that's even some things I've actually never presented to folks. I'm interested to see how people respond.
Yeah.
So
The ideas that we've got right that we put in there, they now have a lot more data to back up.
Really? How do you guys get most of your data?
I'll talk about that too, through the product, is the answer, at least for me. And we get a certain amount of it, we do partner with some of the big marketing firms, so we have very good
Do you normally
relationships
find
with
that they
both
already have
Edelman
vision
and
and
Omnicom.
strategy and everything that
So
help
we
us
get a
do
certain
it,
amount of data from them,
or
we
is it a
give them
one time
some data
thing?
back, and so they've been very collaborative with us.
That is really nice.
So a lot of it is like they come up with these big ideas that they mostly base on polls. And then we go out and say, okay, well, that seems right, well, let's see if we can measure it.
Yes, which I find might be better than someone who has a strategy. Totally. It's a game changer to have stats and measurement. And you're like, people care. They're like, so I go, look, I'm
That's what you want them to do. They say they care. Okay, great. However, they actually do what they do. And say, oh, what do they say they care for?
Yes, it does.
So we're not yet at the point where we're able to say something like, if you do this impact thing, you'll have this effect.
Sorry.
We're at the point of view, so why was it with some of the internal data? So, like consumers do.
Retail can like.
So,
your own campaigns for the companies, or are you working with the ad agency?
I do.
both. Depends on the program. So some of them, there's as many as 3 agencies involved, and some it's just us in the company. It really depends. So we are doing program with them right now. It's a very, very friendly relationship. And it was one of those kind of frustrating meetings as we were in the conversation that we absolutely love what you guys do. We just built our own product to do something very much like this. If you had been here a year ago, we would never have built it. We would have used your stuff. But we kind of got this horse and we got it. And so we're very closely aligned. We do a lot of talks with them, a lot of presentations with them. In fact, we're doing one in May. So it's more parallel, I would say. We definitely see things in very much the same way. So I would say we've kind of productized a lot of what they innovated.
What is it, like a social presentation?
There was one for me.
Is this specifically related to social?
When you say what are the golden examples of purpose-driven companies, they're always in the top.
Okay.
Without question.
Where is it that they use registered
Well, as far as emerging trends, it's moved a couple of these things, but I think part of it was just knowing exactly who they wanted to be. And so now there's a conference about this,
I was like, how are you?
starting with purpose, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm just going to worry about all the other things you're supposed to think about when you're developing a company and things. You just got to focus on just the core business. But a lot of the things that you don't focus on really hard to bring noise. And culture to diversity.
Oh, private. Okay,
And they aren't bolt-ons, they're not things you can take care
Oh,
of.
I
And
work
think
with a
part of the reason they've been
nonprofit
successful in
in grant management.
Oh, okay.
because they started
I
from the
worked, I
beginning.
didn't know
And you
that.
can transform
I looked at
things.
it, like an agency that.
I imagine the grants.
And
Oh,
there are a few
okay.
positive examples.
And then I just
It's really positive examples represented.
Just see if there's like confused.
I did not know, that's what I was telling Pat, that's a whole other.
That was,
yeah,
that's not
I
something
was-
that-
Reception, nice to you that we were here.
Yeah.
I actually,
I guess what are your
No, go ahead.
It was attractive to me.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
I think that there's a couple things
Because
that
I
play
went to
there.
work
So B
in
Corp is
state, right?
distinct from public benefit corporations.
With corporations.
Or just.
and-
I thought they were the same.
Yeah, they're two different
Okay.
things.
So,
So
yeah,
B Corp
that
has
was
been around
what
for
I liked
longer,
about
and it's just a certification.
corporate giving.
So it's like being a 7,000 certified or whatever. It's just a self-certification that says we live up to certain best practices. And being a public benefit corporation means it's actually in your own investment
One
corporation.
person who
It's a
managed
legal
above
thing.
me
And you actually can use it as a argument for
it
your
comes in
business
stacking
decisions.
to how much.
So you can actually say, we are not going to pursue this line of business, even though the
Skeleton
otherwise are
crew.
looking for us to do from a
But yeah,
business
we have,
perspective, because it does
one
not line up.
person who does properly charity. Your shareholder, your nine shareholders.
Well, they can, but it's much harder. And
One
they're very
market
much
person.
signaling what you're about.
Two people
So
who
they're
all very
related and definitely crossover.
So, yeah,
But, you know,
that way it's-
just as a public
it's a
benefit
lot,
corporation, you have to
but-
have a mission, but you don't have to live up to the same governance standards as a public corporation.
Which one?
Whereas B Corp, you have the governance standards, but you don't have to have a
They do
specific.
mental health,
So,
Yeah,
related
services
enough.
for.
Just been going around with it.
And you can be both.
Hi.
So where you working now?
We're set up as a public benefit corporation.
I was surprised to
that
learn
signaling exercise.
that.
Has it really served us in any significant way? Not sure.
A few bounties
And
around.
that sounds as a very unsatisfying answer. It
How
probably
do you
helps us
answer?
marginally with trust building with clients.
Contact,
It
I've
hurts
worked with
us a lot
someone
with
who
investors.
worked there, I've worked there.
So
You wanted to be in
I
that.
don't know where I'm at.
I do want to be in fundraising per se, but I do like to
It's
start
literally
some
in its
aspects of
best
it.
way.
Yeah.
This was not
Building
our
and
first
forming
This was
relationships.
a full partnership.
So that part of it
Final
really
decision.
attracts me.
And our champion
I'm
takes
also
a really
very-
to say the P words. In this
Okay.
case, benefit.
Yeah, figure out.
Like it was here.
Yeah.
And I was then gonna have to justify it. Because they associate it with, I don't really care about it.
I would say so.
I am more
National
eager.
Right. Most of the
Thank you.
I funded a lot of
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I would be girls. So that would last like a very nice.
Hello, everybody. My name is Linda Stetler. I am the co-organizer of NetSquared Chicago. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. I have things up on the board. I know probably some people can't read. But tonight we have Dan Ratner from Public Good Software. From March, I have Erica Spangler-Ross talking about board governance. I can't remember her organization, but they provide low-cost legal services to nonprofits and small business. Erica Spangler-Ross is the specialist for nonprofits, so come out for that. I am working on getting an expert for cybersecurity. I have somebody who's a data scientist, and I have somebody else coming out potentially. So those are things that hopefully will get sorted out, and you'll know whether that's April, May, or June. So if any of that strikes your fancy, feel free to come out. NetSquared Chicago meets every Wednesday, the second Wednesday of every month. Most of our stuff has been here at 1871. We bounce around from different conference rooms. We're here tonight because we expected a bigger crowd. We have water, we have snacks, we have sweet snacks, salty snacks, we have nuts. So if anybody's hungry, feel free to help yourself. And if anybody needs like bathrooms or other things, feel free to contact me. I think some of the Net Impact people have been here, so they can probably help you too. And so no need to, feel uncomfortable. We'll get you to a bathroom if you need to. And if you have any questions, let me know. There's a sign-up sheet for NetSquared Chicago. We are on the Meetup app, so that is how you can find us.
Hi, thank you, Linda. Hi, I'm Neural Uses. I'm with Net Impact Chicago. We've got a leadership team here as well. We've got Casey Weiser Marcus over there who helped with check-in, and we've got Ben Wong who helped with attendance and general event organization. So Net Impact is a career development group of professionals at all career stages. Students are welcome to come as well, but our events are geared towards practitioners who are interested in having an impact, whether it's civic, environmental, social, or business. And you don't have to be in the field already to take advantage. We're trying to have monthly events, mixture of social and content events. It's our first partnership with NetSquared, great content, and hopefully it's not our last. And I'd like to introduce Dan Ratner, who's our speaker. So at the end, we'll announce our future events and things like that. For now, Dan, please take it away.
Thanks, Linda. All right, everyone. Let's start with another thank you, which is to all of you. And it's not just thank you for listening to me, and it is not just thank you for coming out on a cold February night. It is thank you for the work that you're all doing around purpose, which is why I'm guessing you're all here tonight. I think it is incredibly important work that all of us try to do. It is often thankless work that all of us try to do, because people think, oh, if you're doing purpose, it must be very rewarding, it must be very fun, and it can be that, but it can also be very stressful and can also be very difficult. And so we're all trying to learn, we're all trying to make it better. But thank you, each and every one of you. It is very nice to be here as part of this community, really focused around purpose. I want to say thank you to one other group. Anybody recognize any of these folks up here? So those are Alexander Fleming, Ernst Chain, Howard Florey, and Norman Heatley. And that is the great town of Peoria, Illinois. And the reason why they're up here is because they invented antibiotics, which is the reason I'm standing up here tonight. Because on Monday, I didn't think I was actually going to be able to make it because strep tore through my family over the weekend. But I'm glad to say I'm on 2 feet tonight, thanks to these fine folks and their purpose work in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, 30 years to get it done. But, credit where credit is due, whatever it is that makes things possible. So what I was going to do this evening was just to spend a little bit of time just kind of talking about my entrepreneurial journey, which is something Earl really wanted me to focus on, and then spend a little bit of time talking about kind of what public good is, because it really pertains to the most important part of what I really want to talk to you about tonight, which is these trends that we're really seeing in the way that corporations in the corporate world are really reforming themselves around purpose, at least through our unique lens, I think, for public good. So I thought I'd share some data that we've been accumulating over the last year or two, including some new things that I actually haven't shared with anybody else yet, that I hope you'll find interesting. Feel free to challenge me on any of these points if they don't sound right to you. I always welcome feedback, or to ask questions if you want me to dig into detail on anything. So I've been doing this tech startup thing for a while. I started my first company in 1997, and have done startups in everything from telecoms to selling used cars online. But I would say I really kind of found my groove when I ran into this amazing young entrepreneur named Genevieve Thiers, who wanted to revolutionize childcare using technology. I didn't know much about childcare. I did know a lot about technology. So we got together and we built this company called SugarCity. And it remains to this day the largest dedicated service for providing quality childcare online. It was a great business. I thought she was a great co-founder, so much so that we got married 5 years later. But it also was an introduction to purpose. And what I mean by that is, even in the first year or two that we were in business, we started getting spontaneous emails. We got cake and cookies in the mail. We got letters from customers saying things like, "You saved my job," or "You saved my marriage." And I was thinking, going, whoa, I knew that this internet thing was cool, and I knew we could build great businesses, but I didn't know that we could really make a positive change in people's lives while actually running the company at the same time. And I kind of felt like after that, there was kind of no going back. That was, I kind of think of as my gateway drug for purpose. But it absolutely was transformative. And when we ultimately decided to step back from the company a few years later, I'm kind of thinking about what would be next, and sort of half-heartedly pursuing an idea in social commerce. And maybe that came through when I was pitching it to a venture capitalist, because he looked at me and he said, "It's a good idea. I've got a better idea." So what's your better idea? So you should come join my startup. So what's that? So it's Obama 2012. Okay, tell me more. So this was in 2011, and I joined the technology leadership team for the president's re-election campaign. Spent a year and a half thinking that I had known something about technology and marketplaces and the way that people buy and sell things online, and getting completely and totally schooled. I thought there was this stodgy old political world that just needed to be brought up to date. What I learned was, in fact, it was very much the opposite. That there was a very deep understanding and a very mature thinking around the way that people associate, organize, and think about the causes that they care about. It just hadn't been translated into the digital world completely yet. And so we tried to, in at least some small way, make that happen and see what can happen when you have the power of huge numbers of people all making relatively small but significant efforts, but all pushing in the same direction at the same time. So when you're running a presidential campaign, you've got one KPI. You don't know how you're going to do until the very end, and you either hit it or you miss it. Fortunately for us, we hit it. Those were the good old days. But you then have this very surreal moment where a day passes where you're kind of in limbo and you don't really understand which way is up. Then the president comes to headquarters and he gives an incredible speech, which has all of you in tears. Then he comes around and gives every one of you a hug, which puts you in more tears, and then you get fired. Now, this is par for the course planned for. When I was pitching people to come work in this thing, I would say, "Oh, I've got a great idea. You should give up your job, XYZ big Silicon Valley tech firm, take a 95% pay cut, move to Chicago, live like a college student, work 18 hours a day, and in 18 months, no matter what happens, I'm going to fire you." And yet, strangely, people came. Something I still cannot entirely explain, other than the fact that it just shows how motivated people can be when they get that opportunity to really engage in something which is extremely meaningful. And I know that's something everybody in this room subscribes to in at least some way. So when that was over, a number of us still found it difficult to go back in sort of the quote-unquote normal tech sector. And we're kind of thinking about what we wanted to do next. And originally what we thought we wanted to do was to take a lot of the ideas that we developed around organizing and really bring those out to the nonprofit and NGO community as a new technology platform. Open source what we could, build the rest, and kind of take things from there. But as we really got in and started to study the market and kind of see what was happening, and we realized, as you often do in technology, that any innovation is very rapidly copied and developed in other places. And what had been a fairly underserved market was becoming a reasonably served market. But more even than that, that we're solving the wrong problem. love them, or in some cases that are very notable, hate them. We know who's running for president. I mean, it's not an identity problem. It's not an awareness problem. It's not an issue of not knowing what the people stand for, what they're about, except in rare cases of misinformation. But even then, that's not really substantially the issue. The issue is allowing people to organize. But in the case when you're dealing with—
Sorry, did you say allowing or aligning?
I would say enabling or empowering would probably be a better word. And more catalyzing even, because it's something they're already trying to do, but you can help them to do it more easily and therefore do it at a bigger and more effective scale.
But without polarizing them.
I won't say there's never any friction, but it's still allowing people to be expressive. But that's not the case with most nonprofits and NGOs. Anybody care to guess how many nonprofits there are in the United States? Too many.
Altogether, somewhere about 1.6 million.
That's very close to right. Yeah. So Meetup.
I just looked up that figure. But that's not just 501c3s. That's like all of them.
C4s and C6s. It's actually about 1.2 million in the C3s. And I know that's not an industry. I know it's a tax status, but it still just kind of shows you how fragmented it is. There's no conceivable way that you could possibly know all the organizations that are working on even the smallest part of any individual sector. And yes, of course, like anything, it's a bell curve. There are some of the big organizations and a lot of small ones, but it's still a very difficult problem. And then the other problem is communicating with somebody in the way that makes sense to them. And so that was something we felt like we really could bring from the rest of the digital world. In the same way that all the services that we use every day, that Amazon has made it trivial to get things, or Uber has made it trivial to get to places, or Facebook has made it trivial to share images. To make it just as easy to find, associate, organize, and ultimately execute around the things that you care about. But that still requires context, because unlike those other things, you already have a desire to do those things. You already have a desire to buy something that you want to buy. You already have a desire to go where you want to go. So how do you get in front of somebody's desire to be able to make a difference? How do you identify that? And then how do you help them to act on that in a seamless and digital experience? And so that's what we really ended up doing with Public Good, is creating tools that were really targeted at doing that. So we started by thinking about what were those moments of motivation. And to us, the answer was great journalism. This was 4 years ago. So this was before the media world was in quite the level of crisis that it's in today, although already rather turbulent. But when we already were seeing that the amount of digital content that was being shared and consumed was greater than ever before, the need of media for new revenue sources was greater than ever before, and the amount that people were saying that the news is simply depressing or upsetting them was greater than ever before. So we wondered if we could do kind of two things. One, change consuming the news from being a depressing to being an empowering experience. And on the other hand, use that as an opportunity to introduce something which was helping to make a situation better. Now, this in and of itself is not a completely radical new idea. Whenever there's a major natural disaster, you probably see Red Cross banners popping up all over the internet. The thing that we did that I think really made it a bit different, other than taking a lot of the ideas that we'd really developed at Obama around organizing, was to bring artificial intelligence to the party. So the notion is, how do you do this? How do you make it scalable? So we developed a system that was able to categorize this content dynamically based upon both preset and non-preset categories and causes, and be able to do that in real time as publishers were publishing data. We've now since taken that out to a variety of different publishers. These are our 6 biggest networks, but we're adding more all the time. And to kind of give a sense for scale, in 2018, we categorized into the technology and 4 million individual pieces of content. So this is something which can't be done by hand. You could do it by hand, I guess, if you're only doing one cause, but you can't do it by hand when you're dealing with, I think, as we were about 200 independent causes, not counting custom campaigns and localized actions that people could take based upon organizations that are actually in their neighborhood. So we really tried to make those experiences very pertinent so that people would engage with them, would learn about those organizations, and would begin a journey towards doing good. Not necessarily just get money, but some way get involved and in some way start to make a difference. So that was the beginning of what is now the Public Good platform. This was great in terms of impact. really felt awesome about the success that we're able to have in terms of doing things like generating support for storm victims, helping to find resources for people affected by violence and all sorts of other works. It's terrible for keeping the lights on. And what I mean by that is, as I said, media isn't struggling. They don't have money to pay for product. In fact, when you're placing things on their page, they don't think they should be paying you. They think you should be paying them. And people are very sensitive, if they are engaging in these actions, about anything not going directly to the organization that they're seeking to benefit. And I understand why that's the case, although I think in many cases it's based on poor information, but nevertheless, I understand why. So we continue to look into this and say, we feel like there's a business case for this, but we're not exactly sure what it is. And then over the next couple of years, really digging into it and finding some really interesting information. One of them is that now 89% of Americans are buying or boycotting a brand based on social impact. Now, this is just a 2018 number. It's a 20-year trend, and it's been going up virtually every year. Now, I understand we're reaching something of a ceiling here.
How did you figure that out?
So this is research from Edelman and Omnicom. So they did broad-based surveys. They actually brought in pollsters to generate these initial pieces of data. And then they also did it through research on their own programs. But I'll get to more of that in a second, because I think that where you're going with that is super important. So, kind of starting with this, the other thing that happened in 2018 for the first time was they asked people, what's the most important purchasing criteria to you when you're thinking about buying a product, assuming that the products are comparable? People listed quality is number 1, price is number 3, and social impact is number 2. It's the first time social impact has ever been ahead of price. That brands arguably can charge a premium if they align with the values of their consumers. That was pretty significant stuff. The next thing that was really interesting was 69% of consumers wanting to work alongside a brand on social impact. This was one that first looked like a footnote in some of the research, and we actually ended up realizing that this was even more important than the first number in many ways. Because one of the problems in social impact generally as a brand is we talk about what you're doing. Sort of traditionally, people think you're supposed to be a little bit modest about the purpose work that you do. But especially if you're not careful about it, it just looks like boasting or patting yourself on the back. You were doing all this great stuff. So you need a reason to have that communication. You need a reason to engage around that. But if that reason is to say, hey, help me, we're doing this great program, you can be a part of it too. And you can be a piece of this, and you can get sort of moral equity in this. Then that starts to actually really resonate with people. And it changes that from, don't tell me how great you are, to, that's awesome, how can I help? And that is a really transformative change. So with that, we redeveloped a lot of our widgets, and we're still doing the ones that you saw before, which we call unsponsored. We developed our sponsored widgets. So these are 2 examples, one for a nonprofit brand. This is one we're doing right now for the NHL for Black History Month. And this is one for a new Unilever brand, which is called Right to Shower, which just launched last week. Brand new brand, launched with its purpose right at forward. Their purpose is bringing dignity to homelessness, and particularly around hygiene. So we've developed dozens of these campaigns now for brands big and small, and everybody from a smaller one like Right to Shower that you haven't heard of to a relatively big company like a Lyft. And we found that our results mirrored what the big marketing agencies anticipated, that consumers in general engage with these contextual, action-oriented campaigns 10 to 35 times more than they did with traditional ads in A/B tests. So that was a pretty exciting result, at least to begin with.
Especially by engaged, Dan, do you mean actually click on it or look at it, mouse over it?
Click on it, but I'll get more into what I mean by the actions part of it in a second too.
Great, thanks.
And that's the other thing, is it's difficult to do a complete apples to apples test because these widgets are full-blown applications. They're not just ads. You can take these actions right there on the page without ever having to leave. And then this was the other really interesting result. We looked at one of the first brands that we worked with. How many of you think about Net Promoter Score as part of your businesses, part of your organizations? Just a few? How many of you know what Net Promoter Score is? Okay, so let me talk about that for a second. Net Promoter Score is sort of the gold standard for measuring consumer sentiment about a brand. It stands, Net Promoter Score, is calculated by taking a survey of all of your customers and asking them to say on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are they to recommend your product or service to a friend or family member? It's that simple. Then you take the people that answered 8, 9, or 10, you subtract the people that answered 0 to 6, and the net is your NPS. So it ends up being minus 100 to plus 100. Anything in the excess of like 50 is considered exceptional. The only kind of household brands you would think of that sort of fit into that category are folks like Starbucks, which is 62, Patagonia, which is somewhere in the 70s. And most of the brands you kind of think of on a day-to-day basis tend to hover kind of in the 0 to 10-ish range, with some notable exceptions like Facebook, which is minus 25. Which I would think they would be a little more nervous about than they are, but hey, that's just me. So we did a big test with a major media brand whose published NPS ranges between about -5 and +5, kind of depending on the day you measure it. And we worked with them on a big relief campaign around hurricane season 2 years ago. And then we took a sample of about 10,000 of the people that took action through their campaigns, targeted them on Facebook, not telling them why they were being targeted. At that time, that was still a thing. And just asked them the NPS question. And we found that of the folks that took action through those campaigns, they reported a Net Promoter Score for that media brand of 92. Now, generally speaking, it's hard to move NPS a couple of points. Something like this, people tell me I'm making up. So we had to replicate it, and we had to also do a control sample. The control sample actually underperformed their published result. And we tried that with a group of randos. We tried that with a group of using the Facebook Magic black box, like people like this feature, and we kept seeing the same result. So we've seen this now replicated a few different times. The only reason why we believe it is because we think our methodology is sound to begin with, and because the result that we're seeing supports the research that the big marketing firms have already done. This is what people wanted to see these brands doing. This brand lined up right around their value, and they felt really good about it. And this result lasted. It lasted months. Some of these people it had been as much as 6 months since they had taken action. So this was a really significant finding because NPS is a KPI for a lot of really big organizations and something they invest a lot of money against. Because there's also a huge amount of research showing that if you're the NPS leader in your category, your cost of customer acquisition is lower, your cost of customer retention is lower, and you end up being significantly more profitable as a result. So it's an indirect tie back to revenue, but it is a tie back to revenue. And for us, that was absolutely key. Because so long as purpose remains something which is a nice to have, then it's the first thing that gets jettisoned when times get tough. One executive moves on to another role, and that was their pet project, and then that cause goes away. And all the sort of challenges that go along with that. So kind of taking these things and rolling them up, we felt like we're really onto something very, very interesting. And now we started working with more and more companies, especially in the CPG space, which seems to really be taking leadership on this. I think because of those CEOs and marketing executives have been reading this research for so long, they've really been looking for ways to differentiate. We've really been seeing especially innovation on this, both there and in financial services, especially insurance. And I think the other reason is just because they're in a position of being substantially commodities except for brand. And so being able to differentiate around anything is super important. So when I first put this part of my presentation together, I thought there were going to be a lot more folks that were really from the nonprofit side in the room, but I think this kind of relates even so to anybody that is kind of running a purpose organization and is trying to think about how to build capacity. But you can also just reverse the logic and say, if we were actually a big organization looking for a partner, how did these things end up aligning? Because we've really kind of spent a lot of time looking at these programs that have been rolling out, trying to figure out which ones are successful, which ones aren't, and what are the common threads that we can really see between the two. So the first one is we've now kind of realized that the big companies fit into kind of 3 phases. The corporate foundation, land. So this is like the Chase Banks of the world. They've got a big foundation, money set aside. The purpose is to do good. But it is not directly tied to anything that has to do with the underlying business of banking. Then you end up in that next piece. There's a CSR department. There's somebody whose job it is to start thinking about things like sustainability, supply chain, maybe a little bit of impact. But again, they're a separate department, and they don't necessarily roll up to any of the core KPIs of the business. So they have a lot of autonomy. Now we're starting to see this emerging crop of post-CSR companies. And I think sort of, for me, maybe the poster child for this is Unilever. A few years ago, their then CEO kind of shocked everybody in the company by saying, I'm getting rid of the CSR department. I'm erasing it, it's gone. I said, what do you mean? CSR isn't important? So no, exactly the opposite. I want every individual brand manager to report to me in CSR and purpose. We only have two kinds of brands here at Unilever. We have purpose brands and not yet purpose brands, and they're going to be purpose brands pretty soon because this is really important. And I want this to be core to everybody and how we think about things. And his successor has doubled down on that and actually put very aggressive targets in place for how they want to market around these things. So they've really been living this in a very significant way. And I've been seeing that being followed up on by many of the other big names in the space. The PepsiCos of the world, the InBevs of the world, the L'Oreals of the world. All of them have started putting timelines on finding a purpose to associate with each of their consumer brands. So I think you're going to see more and more of this starting to enter the market. See a quizzical look at
I was
that.
just wondering what's that really mean for them? What do they do to make their brand purpose?
So, thank you for that. That gets to the three origins for each of the different kinds of brands. So the first one that we see is really from brands that are born in purpose. And so this is Patagonia, this is Tom's Shoes, this is Right to Shower that I mentioned before. Right from the day one when they started the brand, they thought about what is our purpose and why are we here and how do we really orient around that. I'm actually going to jump to the end and say there's having purpose thrust upon them. This is the anniversary of the Parkland shooting. So I think a pretty good example of this is Dick's Sporting Goods. But right after that, they sold an AR-15. They suddenly found themselves in the spotlight. They had purpose thrust upon them. They had to make some decisions. I think for the most part, they made the right ones, but they're in crisis when they have to make those decisions. And it's not a unique case. It happens fairly frequently. It even happened with Starbucks last year, around everything that happened in Philadelphia. But, it's happened in many other cases. Many people think this is a good time to be talking to companies and say, I can help with this situation. We made that mistake. And why I say it's a mistake is not because they don't need the help, but because they're not in any position to receive it. When an organization is in crisis mode, they're not making those kinds of decisions and they're not open to new ideas. You don't want to be talking to these folks. If you know about these folks before they get started, that's great. If you don't, then usually they have their ideas pretty well baked. Where you really want to be talking to is the folks that are trying to achieve purpose. And I think that's what you were talking about. This is a very difficult transformation for the organizations to make. They have to think about what is the right purpose, what aligns with what it is that they're trying to do, how do they execute against that, and how do they do that in a way that doesn't accept any kind of backlash. And that kind of gets, well, I'll get to how that could do that successfully when I kind of talk about the program. And I think if you're trying to figure out who the right people to be talking to are, another common mistake is thinking that you talk to the foundation manager or the CSR folks. They will be consulted and they need to be consulted. But the folks that are actually making the decisions on this in a post-CSR company, they're the communications folks, the marketing folks, and most importantly, the brand manager. That's the person who's really figuring out what the alignment is like. So if you're looking for your partner, think about those as ways of really creating segmentation and thinking about who it is that you really should be talking to. So then you kind of get to that place about how do you build a program. And I think this is also one that reflects from either way, whether you're an NGO trying to build a program that would appeal to one of these corporations, or whether you're a corporation thinking about how do you transform into cause. There's some things that we've seen that really kind of fit across these are, for example, the ABCs: authenticity, a little bravery, and consistency. So kind of getting into these at least a little bit. Authenticity, does the thing you're trying to do purpose-wise actually align with your business? And it's not just because that's good business, but it's also because it only makes sense. I mean, I think about a couple of canonical examples that really bother me. One of them is a building that I go into fairly frequently because I have a doctor that's in the building, and in the lobby, there's this big sign, and it says, we've had this wonderful drive for cancer research. And it's from the building management company. It's like, I love cancer research. I think it's great that you're doing that. You're a building management company. What does that have to do with cancer research? I don't get it. I don't get the connection. Why does every telecoms company, every one of them without exception, make education their cause? I love education. I think many organizations should support education. It has nothing to do with my cell phone. So the connections don't really hold up. They pick these causes because they're seen as completely non-controversial. but they absolutely lack authenticity. The only reason they've gotten picked is because some executive there thought it was the right thing to do, and because they thought it was something they weren't going to get in trouble for. But then you think about those brands that are so successful around cause. So let's go back to a Patagonia. Conservation only makes sense if you're selling outdoor equipment. Or a Starbucks. Free trade only makes sense. And supporting refugee programs only makes sense if you're thinking about your employee base of baristas or you're thinking about your supply chain of coffee. These things just fit. It makes sense. And that's the authenticity piece. If it doesn't just sort of line up with what it is that they do, it's never going to really feel authentic. The second piece, and again, I'm going to do these out of order, is the consistency piece. If you only seem to come to the party when the going gets rough, then people are going to be very skeptical about your motives. And I think this kind of gets a little bit to a crossover with bravery, but I think a really good example of this was actually all of the big outdoor apparel manufacturers making their various statements about the administration's decision to open up national monuments to oil exploration last year. I think the one that got the most attention was Patagonia's when they put a full-page cover on their site that said the president stole your land. Now, many of us think about Patagonia as being like hipster San Francisco brand. They are not. The majority of their revenue is people that are actually using their equipment for hunting, for fishing, for hiking. And this is not necessarily a particularly local group of people. But I think at least part of the reason why they were able to execute that campaign successfully and not only not get punished for it, but get lauded for it among almost all of their customers is because they were completely consistent about a message of conservation and completely authentic to what it is that they stand for as an organization. And the reason it got attention is because they were willing to make a statement that was that bold. That's the bravery part. Whereas REI made a very strong statement, they were still more polite about it. So
did they get a lot of negative backlash?
Very, very little.
Really?
They actually got a huge amount of earned media. A lot of folks kept saying, are they going to get negative backlash? Are they going to get negative backlash? But it never really materialized. And in fact, I didn't put this data in here, and I wish I had. I've actually done a certain amount of work looking at the consequences of getting negative backlash for purpose campaigns versus the potential for positive impact of doing purpose campaigns. And although you can get negative backlash tends to be very short-lived. Positive impact is harder to achieve, but tends to last much longer when you're actually successful in getting it. So sometimes it's actually able to justify that risk. This is some data. I took the brand off it because I hadn't asked their permission to share this data before we did this. But I wanted to share it with you because I think it really kind of gets again at this authenticity piece. So this is a major skincare company. We ran a campaign for them around natural disasters. They were providing a lot of basic support for people in natural disaster zones all over the United States on all different kinds of issues. So we ran a campaign for them on hurricane relief. We ran a campaign for them on the California wildfires. And we ran sort of general natural disaster campaigns on a variety of other issues. The association with skincare and natural disasters is a little bit challenging, I think, in some cases. Now, the overall response rate, you see an engagement rate of like over 4% on any kind of digital unit. It's crazy. So I'm certainly not being skeptical about anything there. But if you take that down and then pull it apart, you see that the wildfires one is so dramatically outperformed anything else. And when we dug into that, we realized that the reason for that is because their products are used to treat burns. They're used for that kind of first aid work. It makes sense that they are out there dealing with fires. Whereas you're thinking about hurricanes, skincare? Not sure I get it. So there was a little bit of a disconnect that was happening with some of that data.
But there are rashes and other things with hurricanes and bad water and other things that, so the hurricanes.
I don't disagree, but by the time you've explained that, you're pretty far down the pipeline. This is, a consumer's first impression when they're looking at a slot, right? They've just read the article, they see a brand, they see a message. And this is, did they even bother to learn more? So not necessarily did they bother, did they give or do anything like that, although I'll get to that in a second.
You're saying even 4% is pretty good for a digital campaign. 6% is sort of.
Challenge anybody in the digital marketing space to show me campaigns that regularly perform at 4%. It's a crazy number.
Question for you, how long do these campaigns last? So for example, that one,
This one, well, there were a few stages to it, but it was over a course of 3 months.
Okay.
And that is not a normal number, I understand. So then the next piece of these is how do you take it and how do you actually package it? And so this is another thing that we've seen is, these are really kind of the 4 elements to it is possible. It's got to be, the possibility of the thing has to be that it's big enough to matter. Otherwise, you just don't really care. Am I actually solving a problem, or am I just trying to bail out the ocean a cup at a time? And I'll kind of put that together with the second one before I dig into it a little bit, which is practicality, which is small enough to be achievable. So take something like Atom Shoes. There's reasons why people are skeptical about their program. I won't really get into those. But one of the reasons why it's so successful is because it absolutely fits with possible and practical. I can get a pair of shoes for a kid who doesn't have shoes. That's awesome, and that's going to make an impact on their lives. This is going to cost me $60 or whatever. That's practical. I was going to pay that much for a pair of shoes anyway. So it fits into both of those things. I'm excited about it because it's meaningful, but it's not completely outside of my means and completely impossible for me to achieve. Empathy is the third one. It has to be easy for me to understand how this is going to change somebody's lives, because ultimately that's what drives altruistic behavior. And people aren't getting to directly see the benefit. No matter how much we would love to be able to close that loop, you're not going to see the kid get the shoes. You have to be able to imagine it. And so that has to be something which is really concrete. And the more concrete you can make it, the better. And the last one is the immediacy piece. It's what do you care about right now? Because if I have to also be in the business of making you care about the thing before I can try to convince you to act on the thing, I now have 2 bridges to climb instead of 1. And so if we could get into context and say you're already thinking about this, you're already motivated around this, now how do we then make it easy for you to actually act on this thing? Then you only have to cross 1 chasm instead of 2. I've just mixed my metaphors horribly. This is the antibiotics talking now.
Go on. I just think that list, and can you go back to would you mind?
Yeah.
And just to get that whole list makes me think like why the whole climate change piece is so hard.
Absolutely.
All of those, right?
Because you're completely, absolutely trying to bail out, literally trying to bail out the ocean in some cases. But no, you're absolutely right, because it doesn't really pass any of these tests. The next thing is ladder up. This is one I really see a lot of specifically nonprofits struggle with. I think that I find the brands actually have a little bit better of a handle on this. But this is one of the things I had wrong when I went to Obama. I had been trained in e-commerce. Once you have somebody ready to buy something, you just let them buy it. You put the blinders on, you take the navigation away, you just let somebody go through their checkout flow. And you want to see this done perfectly, just go to Amazon. It's, always buy buttons, and once you buy, you're just checking right out. Because you don't want any distractions. You don't want people to think, oh, well, if I go back and add one more thing, because it's very likely that they will leave. In the world of cause, that is not true. So you want to measure it because your mileage will vary depending on your specific campaign and kind of how you have things built. But in many cases, we've had programs where folks insisted the only thing they wanted to do was raise money. We can do that and build a donation tool. But the response rates for this, it's fine, but it's not exciting. But when we can put multiple actions into a campaign and build engagement around that and give people both the opportunity to take what we call engagement actions, so things like learning more or sharing something, as well as impact actions that are not just giving money, like volunteering. And we found that not only is the total number of actions people take increase significantly, but even the number of donations increases significantly. So there's actually a huge benefit to being able to do that. And when you kind of dig into that with folks, they give you a variety of answers for why that's true. One of them is classic chasm crossing, that going from awareness to conversion in a marketing funnel was almost impossible if you don't pass through consideration somewhere along the way. And then the other reason is just their immediate reaction of, oh, you're just treating me like an ATM. And when you think about them as a whole person and acknowledge them in that way, They tend to be much more responsive, and rightly so. And some people have different things that they're able to give. So just some thoughts. We explored this a lot more in our white paper, which I've linked to up here, and we're constantly publishing some new things about this on the blog. But I think kind of the common thread that's running through this, to me at least, is that there is this new sense of purpose in these organizations, and there is this opportunity for really exciting alignment. We get to see a little microcosm of it through a tool, and that's what I tried to really share with you today, is kind of some of the pieces of that. But the research that I shared earlier, not just from us, but from others, is really showing that I think this is a rising trend that has a lot of opportunities. As employees of companies, it's something that we can really push on. As consumers of products, it's things we can really push on. And as people that are executing against mission and purpose, it's something we can really benefit from. So with that, I'd love to take any questions that you have. Yeah.
Thank you so much. First of all, this was really fascinating and wonderful. I'm a digital marketer, also with background in nonprofits. I have two questions. So first, the media partners that you partner with, like Meetup and the others, according to your site and your business model, it looks like they're gaining some revenue through these types of campaigns. Is that like how does that work? Is that like a percentage of funds raised, for example, for fundraising campaigns, or what does that kind of look like?
It's a revenue share arrangement.
Revenue share, okay. And then second.
But no, it's not a percentage of funds raised. That's one thing I should be clear on.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question is, so in terms of how the AI component works, is that essentially where you're matching specific campaigns that already exist with relevant news stories?
Both. So we do that,
okay.
And we also composite campaigns on the fly.
Oh.
So something like if we wanted to deal with an issue like hunger or homelessness, those tend to be very localized. So I don't want to show you a campaign for an organization in New York.
Right.
That wouldn't make any sense. That's not true for something like a natural disaster. Obviously, you want to be localized to the natural disaster. So we have a variety of both business rules and classifiers and other algorithms that we've trained on those issues so that they can try to create relevant results for an individual, but that is still entirely contextual.
Right.
So we're not doing any kind of behavioral targeting at all. So we're not trying to do what I at least personally think of as the creepy big data stuff.
Yeah.
At least on people's individual data.
Right. So then for those on the fly types of campaigns, are the nonprofits that you're kind of pairing with these, relevant news stories, are they already kind of partners with you, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. And so they may have some surprise donations come to them.
So we've had organizations get mailbox money and getting very excited.
Yeah. I have one more question though. So are you familiar with Outbrain and Tabula and those types of? So obviously their purpose is different from public good. But do you feel like, from a technical perspective, your approach and product is similar to theirs?
There's some similarity. I mean, they're trying to, like we are, try to find relevant content to the other content that they are matching to.
Right.
I think in terms of the functional model, it's completely different. I don't want to take somebody off of that piece of content. I want to keep them in context, and I want to build on that content.
Right.
So I think that's very different.
Yeah.
I think we're better at it than they are.
Yeah.
But that's just my opinion.
Yeah. Well, you obviously have way better quality content.
Oh, who knows? But the thing is, I have infinite content because I can custom composite campaigns.
Yeah.
They only have the content they have.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So going back to almost the beginning, the stuff you shared about the NPS stuff was interesting.
Sure.
It kind of made me think of kind of a consumer behavior adage of you kind of get someone to take an action, and that action will kind of force their perspective to shift. Like they will match their mindset to be in line with actions that they're already taking. So you see clients kind of jump on that in terms of helping to drive I don't know, like drive actual business metrics outside of things like NPS and brand behavior.
Well, this
or if you try to stay away from sort of volume driving activities.
It completely depends, and this is where the authenticity thing is so important. Because if you are absolutely authentic, then often your product is just a natural fit for something like this. So in some of the campaigns that we're doing, they actually include a call to actually buy that product. And I think like Right to Shower, one of the ones that I just shared tonight, that's a perfect example of it. You can buy that product because it is directly supporting this cause. Tom's Shoes would be directly supporting the cause. It would just make sense. Whereas if you're saying something like, again, going back to my bank example, like, hey, we're doing all this amazing community development work, come open a bank account with us. That just feels commercial, and that actually generates backlash. And so we've seen that kind of messaging is difficult. It's also why this is not a completely self-service, self-provisioning product. You do need to kind of put it through some of those checks before it's relatable.
So my question around, there's just now so much content out there, like the ability to really reach people when they're just overwhelmed by data and things that are coming at you and information. So I'm just kind of curious how that has changed and how you reach people, really to even take a moment to see what's being offered, how you cut through all of the other noise out there.
Well, I have a big advantage here, which is that part is not, in some senses, my problem. Insofar as what we're trying to do is take somebody who's already made that decision and to enrich that experience. I'm not trying to find somebody out there on the internet and convince them to come and look at this piece of content. But what we are trying to do is to help our media partners to create a differentiated experience. So a reason why you might not want to read all the news on Facebook, for example, because there's actually something that you're going to get by visiting that site, which you're not going to get by reading it through whatever other system you might otherwise be using. So I think from that point of view, we hope over time we may be able to be beneficial. But we are definitely farther down the funnel from there.
So going back to your days with Obama, why did the administration not keep you all on so that you could help educate them about some of his causes like healthcare and getting the public support behind that?
They did keep many of them on.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from an engineering perspective, it's a very different thing. They weren't building more software at that point. But the policy folks, the digital folks, many of them stayed on. And so did some of the technology folks as well. There were opportunities, but the campaign as an organization wound up. The idea of a campaign as a continuous organization that never ends is new as of 2016.
And fundraising for the next election already.
Well, to some degree, everybody's always been doing that at least a little bit, but you formally set up a committee. A committee has a lifetime. It's associated with it. And that is a functionally independent organization, and very rigorously so from the actual government. We're not allowed to communicate with them.
It just seemed like there were a lot of people behind, efforts like going door to door. And then once the election was over, it's almost like I felt like they were kind of left in the dust and forgotten about. They wanted to spend time. They wanted to change the world and make it better. But I don't remember, getting any updates or what can you do to help?
And that's a separate thing. There was an organization that was set up called Organizing for Action, and they tried to carry some of that mantle.
Okay.
I think in some cases more and less successful, but there definitely was an effort.
Okay.
I think we're gonna have to let history be the judge.
I think they're slightly two different animals too, because
They have to be.
organizing for action, some of the tricky parts of that is that there are multiple issues, multiple causes, and multiple, much more specifically targeted segments of, people from various parties that care about different issues and prioritize them differently. And so figuring out which ones, activate the largest segment of the OFA population can be tricky, probably just
Totally
in and
agree
of
with that.
itself.
I had no involvement in it whatsoever, which is why I don't feel qualified to talk about it.
Yeah. And the other thing too is I think it takes more, it's a different skill set too, to take people, canvassing, those types of things are well known. They've been around for political campaigns forever. I just think it's also a different skill set to try to teach people how to organize community groups to combat climate change, or organize community groups to reduce homelessness. Those are different skills, and it takes a different level of effort and a different level of engagement.
And they're definitely related, but I take your point, Mom.
Their priority isn't organizing, it's building their database, isn't it?
Perfect.
Organizing for action.
Again, I don't feel competent to talk about this.
Yeah,
I
okay.
really had no involvement with them. I don't know anything more than anybody else in this room.
Okay.
I tried to participate in some of the things, and it's a different set of things, because you have to get people in a room, or you have to get people to show up for a rally, I can't remember which one I went to, but it's a different set of things, and you have to put in a lot more work and build a network in order to really get a lot of people out for some of these.
Well,
now you see like the Women's March and other things. I think that may have just, maybe it's easier now, but in 2012, I think it just took longer.
One thing
and really requires a lot more interpersonal skills and touches more routinely.
One thing I can say, speaking to that point about is it easier now, is that we ran our unsponsored campaigns now for roughly 4 years. So I've seen a pretty good sample, and we did see a step function in 2016 in terms of conversion. So about 10 to 15% across all cause categories. So I do firmly believe that we are in a completely different age of activism than we've been in the past, independent of political affiliation and independent of cause, at a level that we really haven't seen since perhaps the 1960s or even earlier. So I do think that to some degree it's easier, although there's actually more noise, but certainly people are more motivated if people are doing more than they have done in the past.
You talking about a step function in the usage of your widget?
Not usage, conversion.
Of conversion of people who actually use
So the same experience provided exactly, and yet just more people were actually taking advantage of it to do things. And again, this is just a case where what we saw just lined up with a lot of other research that was out there of both. And I really do recommend, by the way, these other 2 reports down here, the Edelman Earned Grant report. There's actually newer versions of these now, both of them, and the Cone Communications CSR study. They both published new reports in 2018, and I haven't updated this yet. They both did a lot of work on this as well. Very, very broad surveys and talking to people about these things and these issues. And really what they were saying is that they've lost confidence in institutions to solve these problems. Institutions broadly, not just government, but also including the NGO community and international governments, international organizations, and so on. And so that's part of the reason why they really want corporations to step up, because people feel that corporations, generally speaking, are at least effective.
I wonder if there's any data if people inside of corporations are starting to try to bring up more conversations about, how can we as an organization do more?
It's definitely happening.
I can't be the only one who's trying to get people in the company.
I hear it from clients all the time. And when we're talking to potential partners, it's one of the 2 stories. It's either I'm hearing it from my employees, and that's generally speaking more of your B2B firms, or it's I'm hearing it from my consumers, and that's generally more your B2C firms.
To that point, do you see any rumblings or growth in using services like yours for recruitment and retention? I don't know what generation we're on.
Gen Z.
Or just the workforce in general, or?
I think people are very, very squarely understanding that purpose is important for, I kind of am clumping it into the digital generation, sort of broadly. And some folks have been saying, oh yeah, we've been talking about this for a long time. Like Johnson & Johnson will tell you about their creed, for example, which has been around for 100 years for that purpose. But I think that they're getting it pretty squarely. The degree to which they're executing on it is definitely a variable. But I go to a lot of social impact conferences, and it's pretty darn consistent. And the brands that are showing up are really across industries. It's not shocking to anybody here to say everybody's thinking about it. But I don't know if the solutions are entirely clear to a lot of them yet.
I have a question, and if you can't speak to it, I completely understand. I'm wondering about companies like Nike, for example, that in past 10, 20 years had a lot of negative media information on them because of their slave labor, essentially, in Bangladesh and other various countries, and then they come out with more positive media, where they take stance against the president and things like that. How does that work if there's competing things, and maybe there's a company like Nike that's still doing all this slavery in all these countries and yet has a public image that is trying to portray them as being much more positive?
I actually gave a talk about this at a conference called Marketplace Risk, which was less about when you just have bad practices and more about when you're faced with crisis. It wasn't necessarily if you're on the originating life that exploding good example, like all the way back to the Exxon Valdez. There's actually been some good research that's been done recently about what the economic impact is of those kinds of crises. Are they just PR, kind of just issues for a short time that just kind of go away? Or are they actually substantially impactful for the economics of the company? And I think one of the pieces that I read that was really transformative for me when I was starting to think about that was actually a piece from the Economist Intelligence Unit. And they did a broad survey of all of those issues. And they said, everybody's been looking at this wrong. What everybody tries to do is look for short-term dip in stock price. What you need to do is to look at the medium-term performance of the company relative to a basket of peers and see whether or not you see a pattern emerge. Are they under or outperforming others? Because what you would expect to happen is their customers would go to other places. And when you use that analysis, they actually were able to show that over the course of, I think it was a year, the companies experiencing these massive crises would underperform by about 30% relative to their peers. So it's very, very significant. And then when you look in there at the anomalies within that, and this is some research that we've started doing, and I would love to have somebody who has a broader set of data than I do dig in there a little bit more. One of the things that we saw is that one of the things that is highly correlated to the companies that suffered less than the companies that suffered more was Net Promoter Score. So do you have a good store of positive customer sentiment because generally speaking you do the right thing? Then people are more willing to believe that it was your intention to do the right thing the next time. And so if you have that to draw upon, that's really helpful. Whereas if your NPS was already pretty low, then people will not give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think that was, the place where you start to see exceptions to that is when you have something like Facebook. So when you saw their experience, I think if you had any doubt that they were a monopoly, you really can't after that. It was just yet another indicator that there was simply nowhere for customers to go. They tried to flee, but they couldn't because there's nowhere to go. But this whole thing about does this impact and does having purpose impact your ability to weather those kinds of storms? I believe it emphatically does.
How does a company portray a positive public image though if they're still having millions and millions of people that are slaves?
Well, if you keep doing it, you can.
I mean, how do they make themselves?
But I think that's a bit. I mean, that is a little bit different. If you are pursuing a bad business practice and you continue to pursue that business practice, you can expect to have a positive customer sentiment. But at least if people are aware of that. So I'm certainly not trying to say, oh, if Nike just starts saying like we're going to give shoes to kids, that suddenly people are going to forget about anything that you're saying. And I'm less familiar with their specific situation.
In Nike's specific situation, but reading about when they make these shoes, they have to use these really dangerous chemicals that are really bad for people's lungs. Or for example, H&M and a lot of the major textile manufacturers, they use basically effectively slave labor. That's the cotton's grown in, not the Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and then it ships to Bangladesh, where it's also made in sweatshops by millions of people. So it's in really bad situations.
I would say the one other thing.
And they'll lie to H&M and say, "Oh, we're not doing this," and they'll hide everything if they come and visit. And so it's really hard to try to track them down and use the more ethical manufacturers because they'll lie to your face.
And create distraction campaigns.
Yeah, they'll create distraction.
I would say that probably is a little bit out of the scope of what I've studied. But the one thing that makes me optimistic about it is the rising movement in ESG, because I think that is leading people to be a lot less willing to turn a blind eye.
What is it?
ESG.
By the way, we Net Impact actually had a panel discussion back in November on environmental, social, and governance, that's what it stands for, investing, and how you as an average person and not a Rockefeller Foundation person can invest responsibly. So please, that's a theme that we'll probably have at least once a year, an event on that. So please get on our list and find out about that.
Yeah, the one sentence version of it is it's about a variety of financial products that have been created that use these measures to be able to assess whether or not a company fits their environmental, social, and governance parameters, and uses that to whether or not to include them in those products. So if you want to invest in responsible companies, you can do it buying these assets. The thing that's interesting about it to me is not just that they've done that, it's that they've done it incredibly successfly. Do you know what the volume is of ESG assets now?
It's in the trillions now.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
These are people buying equity in companies?
Yeah.
You
It
buy
could be
like a mutual
equity.
fund if you want to.
It could be. There's different asset classes. That's a whole
There's
nother
even
topic,
ETFs right
actually.
now, I think.
You can probably even ask your company if they have that, because it's a big thing that's coming up at companies because they are more profitable. So if you just look at the S&P average, it outperforms a lot of normal stocks. ESG is just skyrocket, and that just goes back to, I think consumers are getting more savvy. It's a risk mitigator too, being socially conscious as well. Back to the thing with Nike. Nike was one of my old clients, but they are trying to make a shift, and I think it goes back to what you were saying is an organization can try to drive toward that, but if it's not ingrained in their DNA, it's hard to change culture. So it's a culture shift, right? So with a company globally from a supply chain, they're so complex, they just don't know who they're contract manufacturing out to, right? They can't manage all that, but I know that they are making an effort to kind of track who's doing what. But those contract manufacturers can contract out as well. You lose a lot of visibility, but a lot of companies now are trying to track that and come up with metrics. And you'll see, I think, in 10 years, when you see on Wall Street they come up with their earnings, there's going to be sustainability metrics.
The only way they can do that sustainably is if they hold those foreign manufacturers responsible. It shouldn't just be, they don't use us, we can just get another business over here. It should be like, no, this is detrimental to our business if we're not treating our employees well.
But also think consumers have the buying power, right? So if consumers are knowledgeable, they just won't buy it. I think there was a stat that you had up there that
The consumers, but I would also say, and investors. And that's again why the ESG stuff is really exciting to me, because then it's saying it's not just, hey, consumers, sorry, I just need to put up my next quarterly numbers.
Could we have the people who didn't get to ask a question, be asked next? Thanks.
Oh, I just was wondering how much of your work is done with international organizations and businesses, and also how does the U.S. stand with this sort of technology compared to other countries?
Almost all of my clients are global,
Okay.
but I almost always work with their U.S. subsidiaries because I'm a 10-person startup company.
Because what?
So I don't have a global footprint yet.
Oh,
I'm working
okay.
on it, but I'm not there yet. So we hope to be able to work with them on a global scale. But I would say that the companies that I see as being the most sophisticated about this do tend to be global perspective companies, especially in consumer goods. Many of them based in Europe, many of them based in the United States. But I think the thing that surprised me when I got into this game was I thought that the organizations that were really going to be taking leadership on this were going to be left coast, because they've always kind of talked such a good game about it. And I've realized is that they talk a really good game about it, don't really do very much. And kind of when you dig into the culture of it, that's really not so surprising. because it has been such a money and metrics culture now. Whereas almost every organization, at least that we serve, and that has kind of engaged really significantly, is east of the Mississippi. So I know there are exceptions, and like I've mentioned, probably ad nauseum, Patagonia and Starbucks, which are obviously left coast companies, but certainly outside of the tech space.
I'm just wondering if how U.S. consumers compare to international.
Oh yeah, so those two reports that I reference here do compare to benchmarks, and I would say that as I recall, and this is going to be a little bit memory, but it's not that much different compared to Europe, especially. There's some difference, but it's not dramatic.
And I just want to let everybody know this is being recorded, and so we'll make sure everybody does that. Yeah. And so you'll have that to reference back to. And Dan has also said he'll make the slides available. So we got you covered if you need to refer back to anything.
Thanks. Question, and we'll ask a few more questions, and then we'll go to the next step. In terms of can you talk a little bit about your progression as a business? Like, how many people are you? And you went from sponsored to non-sponsored. You must have had some changes in your business model. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, behind every overhead success, I think, is a 3 or 4 year backstory. And I think that certainly was true for us. We spent a long time working on this. And actually started with the unsponsored pieces, really focused on impact, without necessarily 100% understanding where exactly the revenue was going to come from. And I think that, for me, is a thing that actually made us feel a little bit more left coast and a little bit less Midwest. I feel like we were trying to do something which was very disruptive without necessarily understanding the entire business first. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. That just happens to be the approach that we took. And so you were still a relatively small team. I know that a lot of the folks at 1871 would say we were 10 or 12 people. That's significant, but we're certainly not big by any stretch of the imagination. But I think we built a product which scales really nicely. So we don't necessarily need to bring on a huge number of additional people in order to make it work. And that was kind of the whole point about making the AI systems work right from the start. So what we actually ended up doing was the first versions of the widget, we spent almost all of the time and attention on the targeting and none of it on the UI. The original version of this was just a button. And then once we had the targeting right, we actually moved on to develop the UI. So we kind of went backwards. They were always supposed to start with what does the consumer see and how do they respond to it. But we had a good enough response from that very basic system that we felt confident that we could overcome any other issues as we got into the design work. So we've now developed multiple different versions of it. I just showed you one of our most basic tools. We also have a chatbot. We have buttons. We have dedicated campaign pages. And actually now the first of our brands are actually starting to use our technology to build dedicated impact portals on their own sites. So that's been a really exciting development as well. Whether or not they get a huge amount of traffic is a whole different question. But nevertheless, I think it's pretty fun. And we're seeing that as a trend that's emerging as well, taking ourselves out of it, whether it's Patagonia Action Works or Vice Impact or State Farm Neighborhood of Good or any number of others. We think that the idea of having an action portal is something for your customers to be able to do is something we're going to be seeing more of.
Thanks.
Too many questions.
So what are your when you're pitching a consumer product company, are you pitching a campaign that they're going to they're going to target a campaign and they're going to pay X $100,000 for 6 month campaign, or sort of an ongoing relationship, or how do you approach them? How do they come about? This makes sense for us to do.
I think that's evolving to a great degree. We are still trying to find organizations that, even if they are still in the achieving purpose category in some cases, are pretty firm about what they want to do. They're just not necessarily as firm about how they want to do it. So most of my key clients fit into the category of we have a great program and nobody knows about it. Like, I'll give you one example, which is the one that we're running right now that I showed you, NHL. Everybody knows who NHL is, right? Who knows what Hockey is for Everyone is? Anyone?
What is it, hockey is?
Hockey is for Everyone. So that's their big inclusivity program that they've been running for several years. It's a great program. Nobody knows about it. When a company is in that situation, that's the perfect organization for me to be talking to, specifically for my product.
Sure. Thanks.
I'm curious if you've thought about perhaps expanding outside of news and looking at other types of niches to kind of match content with causes. So like in e-commerce, for example, after a purchase, have you heard of ROKT? ROKT. Essentially, that's what they do. They match some sort of offer after someone's completed a purchase, like your Ticketmaster, for example.
Yeah, it's like for all I was lauding Amazon, the worst thing about the entire site is their thank you page is a disaster.
Yeah.
They just don't do anything with it, and it's a
Exactly.
wasted experience.
Yeah.
I can't tip the hat yet, but I will tell you that we have something coming out in the next couple of months, which is one of those experiences. And I'm extremely excited about.
But check out ROKT as well.
I will.
Thanks. Any other questions? One more?
Sorry. I think to kind of piggyback off of this gentleman's question earlier. So when you're speaking with clients, are they kind of evaluating your product against other advertising platforms, like including like paid search and display and things like that? And how does that, how do your kind of, clearly the ROI seems to be very positive from the nonprofit perspective and surely from the brand perspective too. So how does that also impact how you price your product compared to other ad platforms?
So that's a complicated question, and I would love to dig into it more. And I think we've kind of faced two things that are a little bit at odds with one another. And one is connecting pricing to value in a way which is direct, and the other is reducing complexity in order to make buying decisions easy. And in the short term, we decided to reduce complexity in order to make buying decisions easy. Understanding the fact that it's actually very difficult to make an absolute apples-to-apples comparison between us and the other things that are out there. Because let's say you decided to spend the money you were going to spend on public good and spend it on Facebook or spend it on Google Display or whatever. Okay, you've got to click. Now what? Where are you going to send them? What are they going to do? And how do you create a call to action that is something about actually making the world a better place through that experience? You still have a big build ahead of you. Minimally, that's a big fixed cost build. So you can go off and build a site like State Farm Neighborhood of Good. Or it could also be a big variable cost build because you could also try to license technology or something like that in order to make it happen. And you get none of the service component that goes along with that. We are the full stack application that does all the fulfillment as well. So it's hard to make that comparison completely. So we try to remain kind of cost competitive on the basic metrics, and then just price simply so that we fit easily into their budgets. As we grow, I think there's going to be room for innovation.
Yeah, I think that full stack, the fact that you address that is obviously huge selling. Should be all over your website.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So free tip.
I'll take it.
Our gift to you.
I'm glad to know that I get to learn lots of things here as well. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for bearing with me.
A couple of things, Ben, do you want to announce some of our next events?
So our next Net Impact Chicago event is actually in a couple weeks. September 20th, I put the name up there. No, not September. February 20th. Which is next week, actually.
1 week.
It's going to be on Latinicity from 5:30 to 7:30. This is really our happy hour networking.
Hold on, I didn't get to go to Latinus.
I know. You come.
So
you're welcome.
We'll be louder.
Next week,
You're welcome.
it's going to be really around just networking. We're going to have discussions around CSR, the environment, and then social justice. So we're going to have some discussions around there. So come with business cards. I think it'll be a really cool venue. Really just trying to connect people with
within our community, and you might need some good connections. So we'll see you there.
And if people are interested in networking after this, some people are going to Moe's, which is around the corner on Kinsey Street, for optional after networking if you want to digest what we've done here. Chat and meet your fellow attendees, which we didn't necessarily get to do in the lecture format. Thanks very much, Dan. Casey.
Any feedback, comments, or questions, greatly appreciated. My email address is just dan@publica.com.
This event is free too, so that's another exciting.
What's the difference between Net Impact and NetSquared?
Yeah, we're two different organizations. NetSquared Chicago, we're kind of similar in that we're all volunteer-led organizations that provide free or low-cost educational programming for people. But we are affiliated with TechSoup.org, which is a nonprofit that provides tech discounts for services, goods, all kinds of things, as well as it has webinars, it has other things. So if you don't know about it and you are in a nonprofit or in the nonprofit sector, make sure and you service 501c3s. This is for 501c3s or for libraries if you have a library customer. They are a tremendous resource for you. They are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are just a series of Meetup groups. We are on the Meetup app, and we are a volunteer-led organization, and we just provide programs like this. I try to do them for free, so thank you very much for being willing to come out for free. Dan, I appreciate that greatly, and more than welcome to come on out.
Thanks. And Net Impact is part of a network actually called netimpact.org, and we're the Chicago professional chapter. There's chapters that are in schools, usually in business schools like Loyola, DePaul, University of Chicago, Kellogg, etc. But we're the professional chapter, and we have events that basically cover all the bottom lines: social, if you heard the term triple bottom line, social, environmental, as well as business. Dan, here's a thank you gift. Here's some homegrown honey from one of our board members.
Natural to that.
Yeah.
Hope you feel better.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
for coming out.
Next time, you will. Enter into the group more often.
All right.
Nice to meet you.
Are you on Rachel?
One of Threshold offices is in Ridge, but I live in Edgewater.